Wonderful. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. If you're here for our event with Daniel Mendelsohn and Becca Rothfeld, celebrating Daniel's book, 3 Rings, you are in the right place. My name is Car Johnson. I'm the events coordinator for Green Apple Books here in San Francisco. And we're very excited to have both Daniel and Becca joining us tonight. 3 Rings is a memoir, biography, work of history, and literary criticism all in one. This moving book tells the story of 3 exiled writers, Eric Auerbach, Francois Fenelon, and W.G. Sebald, and their relationship with the classics from Homer to Mimesis. Daniel and Becca are going to have a conversation about this book, and at the end, we'll get to as many audience questions as we can. I encourage you to enter your questions at any time during tonight's discussion. You can submit them in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. It's 2 speech bubbles that say Q&A, and you can enter your questions at any time. I would also like to humbly encourage you to pick up a copy of 3 Rings from us here at Green Apple, and I'm going to share the link now in the chat for everyone's convenience. There we are. And if you've been to one of our events before, you've no doubt heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support events such as these, but you also support the authors who put so much time and so much of their heart into making these books. And you also get to have a book as the end result, which might be the best part. So if you are so inclined and if you are able, I would encourage you to please purchase a copy of Daniel's book. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the 2 folks that are joining us this evening. First, Becca Rothfeld is an essayist, contributing editor at The Point, and a PhD candidate in philosophy at Harvard. She contributes essays, book reviews, and the occasional art review to publications like the New York Review of Books, the TLS, The Nation, the New York Times Book Review, the New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Baffler, and many more. Please do welcome Becca Rothfeld. And last but most certainly not least, Daniel Mendelsohn is a frequent contributor to The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, where he is editor at large. His books include the memoirs An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, a translation of poetry of Constantine Kaafi, and the 3 collections of essays and criticism, most recently Ecstasy and Terror, From the Greeks to Game of Thrones. A professor of humanities at Bard College, he is the director of the Robert B. Silvers Foundation, and his book, 3 Rings, is the reason we are here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Mendelsohn.
Cool. So I watched a ton of talks in preparation for this because I'm not like a big attender of book talks. I'm sort of in favor of reading rather than talking. And so I glean that it's sort of customary to give like a summary of the book if there's not going to be a reading from it. And this caused me a lot of trouble because this book is uniquely difficult to summarize, which I think is to its credit. This is one of many reasons to read it. I could not do it justice. And I think that the sort of, the very admirable attempt at summary that was given, I think just does not even get at the beginning of all the ways in which the book wheels out. But so I thought I would at least try to give like a, 30-second thematic gloss before I get to some questions. So in part, it's about ring composition, which is a narrative technique in which a book meanders away from the primary narrative into sort of a secondary narrative and then returns, which happens in the Odyssey, but also in lots of other books. It's also about diaspora, about the Jewish diaspora after the Holocaust and how sort of Jews are ringing in a circular formation, the sort of their homeland, the old country. It's about attempts at memorialization, about monument building. And it's also about just different kinds of narrative structures, as well as referentiality and digression. And it's sort of in some ways a book that is just like a tapestry of digressions, and yet it seems thematically focused. Do you think that that's a fair attempt at summary?
So far, so good. Yeah.
Great. Well, that's my best attempt. You should buy it because the writing is beautiful. My first question is just, how does one set about writing a book like this? It seems like it would be hard to keep all these references in one's mind at once. I mean, I'm a big outliner of essays that have sort of like a linear argument, but it almost seems like a book like this would have to be written by magic or all at once in one go to keep the moving pieces in one's head at the same time. So I was wondering, just what was your approach to writing something so densely referential?
Well, so this book actually began as sort of outtakes from a previous book of mine, the book called An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, which is a kind of, I think it's called a biblio-memoir, right? It's a book that recounts an experience I had that was related to Homer's Odyssey, in which my then 82-year-old father decided to take my freshman Odyssey seminar at Bard College. And so that was a book about reading a book together with my father. And while I was working on that book, there was a mass of material that I thought would be in that book about the sort of afterlife of the Odyssey and how other people had read it over the years and what happened to it, as later cultures adopted it and translated it and did things with it. And that all became, that digression became so vast that I ended up cutting it and thinking that at some point I would do something with it. And so I had for a very long time been thinking about this narrative technique of the Odyssey called ring composition, which you briefly just described, Becca, in which the story sort of circles away from the main narrative to flash back to previous narratives or other narratives. And sometimes those secondary narratives themselves have secondary narratives, and this sort of endless looping back. And I've been thinking about that as a literary technique, but then I started to think about, it just so happened that some of the writers who have adapted or thought about the Odyssey themselves had these sort of meandering lives as exiles and refugees. And I began to think of this sort of confluence of their literary style or their literary interests in this sort of digressive narrative with their own literally digressive lives. And I think this book, this is the shortest book I've ever written. I think it comes in at 112 pages or something. But it's very dense with a lot of thinking that I've been doing over a very long time. And so the quality that you're referring to, it's a book about digressions that itself is constituted as a series of very self-conscious digressions.
And it's a digression apparently from your other
so
project.
It was just in my head for a very long time. Sorry?
Oh, and it is itself like a digression in a way.
I'm sorry.
Oh, can you hear me? Oh, it is itself a digression, like
the
other book too. Yeah, that's all. So please keep going.
Yes, exactly. It's sort of it's a little a pouch sort of inside of this other book. And so I've just been thinking about this for such a long time that it kind of emerged fully formed from my head when I actually, so I thought, what am I going to do with all this? And I kept thinking about it. I was talking to people about it, which is not something I normally do when I'm writing a book. And then I was invited to give a series of lectures at my alma mater, the University of Virginia. And I thought, well, this will force me to write this stuff down. Otherwise, it's just going to be swirling in my head for the rest of my life. And that's really how it came to be. But I think that quality, Becca, that you're talking about is the result of my having just brooded over this material for, 6 or 7 years before I actually sat down. So it was sort of percolating in my head for a long time.
Yeah, it feels fully formed. That's a good way to put it. Like it seems like something that just had to emerge like in its totality. So I guess my next question is about the difference between a
Yeah, I mean,
digression.
I wrote this.
Please continue. We can digress.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I wrote most of the book. I wrote most of the book, which was a series of 3 lectures in about a week, traveling around Germany on a book tour with lots of long train trips. And so it just sort of popped out, kind of fully formed. It was a very strange experience. Go on. You were going to talk about different kinds of digressions.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about the difference between digression and distraction. Like you have in your book, which I have very marked up with tons of annotations, etc., many of my own digressions, you say digression is never the same as distraction. Its twists and turns are unified in their aim, which is to help us understand the one complete action that is the subject of the work to which they belong. So I wanted to ask, first, if you could say more about the difference between digression and distraction. And second, I was trying as sort of a game as I was reading this to think of as many books as I could that were all digressions and whether it's possible for a book to be entirely digressive. And you describe The Rings of Saturn, Sebald's book, as nothing but a digression. But I sort of wonder if a territory can be all periphery, if engaging in a ton of distraction or digression means that becomes the central subject. But then I was thinking of sort of other candidates like Sebald being the obvious one, Proust, whom you also mentioned being another obvious one, but maybe Bernhard, maybe like Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights. So I wondered if you could give more examples of like sort of entirely digressive books, if you think that's possible.
Well, I mean, the sort of joke about digression, when you talk about digression as a specifically literary technique, is in a work of literature, what is ostensibly a digression is never actually a digression, right? Because it's there for a reason. It's purposeful. And if it's purposeful, it actually can't be a digression. So there's a sort of a paradox built into the very term, in Homer, to take the granddaddy of all digressive authors, when the narrative starts cycling back in what looks like a digression about some previous incident or some mythological allusion, it's obviously there for a purpose. We are supposed to, your work as the reader or the audience is to connect the dots between what looks like a stepping out of the narrative and to see why it is in fact connected to the narrative. So, although obviously some digressions are more digressive than other digressions, so to speak. I just am, because I'm interested, obviously, in Homer and oral narrative, right? Digression is a kind of inborn, innate feature of oral narrative. Think of the way you tell a story. Right? You say, oh, I went to the supermarket to buy a quart of milk. And on the way, I met Mr. Smith. Oh, Mr. Smith. Well, he's that guy that I ran into at a Halloween party last year, and he had the funniest costume. And, well, why was I at the Halloween party? Well, because I knew this person, they had the best Halloween parties. And yeah, I met them in college. So this is, in fact, the way we tell stories. And when they become sort of codified and stylized in literature, they're purposeful. So I would say the difference between a digression and a distraction is that distractions are inherently non-purposeful. And a distraction is an interruption, whereas a digression, although it looks like it's moving away from something, is actually there to point you towards something in a work of literature. And yes, there are, obviously, so who are the 3 rings? In this book, if this book has a plot, so to speak, or a form, it's about 3 writers who are interested in digressive narrative, basically, all of whom also have some connection to Homer, which is the obvious sort of pin that connects them all. And what I'm interested in is how digression works as a narrative ploy. And further to that, because I mentioned that these three writers in their real lives had sort of digressive lives, so to speak, right? So I'm also interested in the way that literary form relates to the way we live our lives. That is, I'm interested in plot. Because digression, so here I am talking about digression and it looks accidental, but it's really purposeful. And that in turn gets you thinking about how plot works, right? The plot of a certain kind of realistic novel, say, has to look fortuitous. It has to look like life and that things just happen. But of course, they're not just happening because an author is making them happen. And so I'm sort of interested in these ways about, one could call the difference or the tension between the ostensibly random quality of digressions and the purposeful quality of a plot in a work of literature.
And it also seems that life itself is often rife with coincidences that, if found in a novel, would seem unrealistic. As I listened to you on Christian Lorenzon's podcast, and you noted this. And so one of the features of this book is that there's just tons and tons and tons of coincidences. That's one of the reasons why it seems hard to imagine writing, because it just seems like it had to emerge fully formed in this way. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. About allowing yourself coincidences in nonfiction that one wouldn't allow oneself in fiction, I guess, is a better way to put the question.
Right. So when I was working on my Holocaust book, The Lost, in which I was traveling all over the world for a number of years, tracking down information about relatives of mine who had perished in the Holocaust, these extraordinary things kept happening. I mean, just unbelievable coincidences and, strange, uncanny meetings. And very hard to, my editor finally said, you have to stop putting these in because no one will believe it. And that got me thinking, what does that mean when we say, oh, if it were in a novel, you wouldn't believe it? Right. And basically, I think that what Three Rings is an attempt to unravel what we mean when we say it's too good to be true. When life provides you with a kind of uncanny patterns that one associates more with the structured quality of art. And when life does that, it really makes you think, well, what do we mean when we say something is lifelike? So part of what I'm trying to do in Three Rings, as I'm telling the stories of these three writers, I'm everything I say is true, but I'm sort of constructing the narrative to draw the reader's attention to bizarre coincidences that connect these three figures together. So there's a culminating one, which I don't want to give away, but about Eric Auerbach, who's the first of my writers. But for example, the middle chapter is about this fabulous work of 18th century literature, which is a kind of a fan fiction based on the Odyssey, written by a French archbishop called Fenelon, who was a tutor to the grandson of Louis XIV. And he wrote this fan fiction as a kind of educational treatise for this young boy, in which Telemachus, the son of Odysseus in the Odyssey, gets his own set of adventures. And so, and he sort of designs this novel so that it kind of fits inside the plot of the Odyssey. So when this fan fiction is over, you're still inside the Odyssey somehow. And I thought that was really interesting. And then I go on, as you said, I go on and I talk about Proust in the second half of this sort of French chapter of my book. And at the very end of this chapter, I talk about Proust, and obviously Proust is also a digressive writer, obviously. And I draw your attention to the fact that Proust is, at a certain point, is writing to a friend of his about this guy that he has a crush on, who is off to a diplomatic mission in Istanbul. And Istanbul is the sort of central place of my book, the place to which or from which people keep running. And he's going on about this guy, and he likes him so much, but it's doomed and it's never going to happen, whatever. And it turns out that the fellow that he has a crush on, whom Proust has a crush on, is a descendant of Fenelon, you know. So there are all these kinds of coincidences, and I just thought it gets you thinking about what is the quality of life-likeness that we prize in literature, and why is too many coincidences, too neat a patterning, not, why do we think that's not life-like, even though it does happen in life? You know, that's the question that excites me. And I say this because, you know, so the first of my three writers is Erich Auerbach, the great German literary scholar whose Mimesis is one of the most important works of 20th century literary criticism, in which he goes through all of European literary history, basically from Homer to Virginia Woolf. But what he's trying to do in Mimesis, the subtitle is The Representation of Reality in Western Literature. How does literature make things feel real? And so I'm taking a leaf from his book, because I'm sort of looking at the other side of the page, so to speak, and trying to think of why we don't accept certain things as realistic in literature.
I guess that brings me to the question of, like, is this densely patterned referential quality, if we found it in life, is it good or is it bad? This is another question that you sort of addressed in Lorenzen podcast. And Erich Auerbach, you talk a lot about this fascinating distinction he draws between what you call an optimistic style, which is the style of Greek narrative in which everything is ultimately explicated, everything is ultimately made clear, and the opaque or pessimistic quality of the Hebrew Bible, in which, like, so much is left obscure. And so, I mean, one question that we could ask is, why describe the style in which everything is revealed, in which all of the digressions sort of exhaustively capture the universe, as optimistic, when in fact it seems like that might be paranoid? Is that like a reenchantment of reality, or is that a crazy making, or both?
Yeah, no, it's funny that you mentioned that, Becca, because I actually, after the book was published, I got an email from a reader who asked the same question. So just to clarify for people who are listening, so Auerbach, in the first chapter of his book, Mimesis, talks about Homer as an example of one way of making things feel real in literature. And he contrasts this Greek way of storytelling, the digressions within digressions within digressions, which assumes that, you know, if you had enough digressions, you could describe everything, theoretically, right? And he contrasts it with the narrative style of the Hebrew Bible. And he specifically uses the example of the sacrifice of Isaac. And he says, you know, in the Hebrew Bible, the narrative style is more opaque. Whoever wrote it, you know, a question will left begged for the time being, right? You know, the author of the Hebrew Bible leaves things out. So Abraham takes Isaac to Mount Moriah to sacrifice him, but you don't, you know, if Homer were telling that story, you would know every place that they went to, the name of the hotel, what they had for dinner, you know, how many camels they took, you know, all of that. And Auerbach actually prefers the biblical style because he thinks it's more realistic. In other words, in real life, you don't know the backstory of every single element of every single narrative that's happening to you. You know, there are things you don't know. And he also makes the very poignant point that Hebrew narrative is like the Hebrew deity. Ultimately, there are things you can never know, never look at, right? And so I think it says something about me that in my own sort of reinterpretation of Auerbach's division between these two kinds of storytellings, I refer to the Greek way as optimistic and the Hebrew way as pessimistic. And so like you, this reader wrote me an email and said, why do you think it's optimistic to be able to say everything about everything? And I think that just probably says something about me, because as you say, and I think all kidding aside, because the third writer I write about is W.G. Sebald, who does write, these endlessly digressive, circling narratives, which, as I say, seem to be all digression, in which, people's stories, real or quasi-real or imagined, are sort of circling around, and you get to know these different scraps of things, biographies, histories, natural science. And it is kind of paranoid. There is this sense that, this endless sort of circling through time and space makes you a little crazy, right? I mean, there's a reason that Sebald's narrators are always people recovering from nervous breakdowns, or on their way to a nervous breakdown, right? So I think your point is very interesting, Becca. I think, as I say, my own choice of words probably says something about me because I'm a storyteller. And so I think, oh, great, the more stories, the better, but maybe not.
Yeah, I share your preference, your bias, and I wonder to some extent whether criticism requires people to adopt a belief in the optimistic model, whether just the mere act of criticism sort of requires you to have faith in the interconnectedness of things.
Yes, because what do we do as critics, right? And I'm always in a sort of funny space because I'm an author and I'm also a critic, so I'm wearing two kinds of head depending on what I'm doing. But I think, to pick up on what you just said, I think that what you do as a critic is make a certain, hopefully, you make a certain set of assumptions about coherence, right? You're looking for patterns, you're looking for the underlying X, Y, or Z of a work. And so you have to be optimistic. You have to assume that it isn't just random. And I would say the most fun kind of criticism, at least for me, is when a book is so dense or so complex that the pattern is not as easy to find as it is elsewhere. But when you find it, it repays the effort doubly.
Where there's many patterns, which was my experience. I wrote a review of this book and it was super short. The word limit was super short. And so I felt oppressed in my inability to discuss all of the.
Well, I know you did a very good job in 2 long paragraphs, I have to say.
My goodness, it was
painful. But that's the fun, that's the fun. But I think that's why I think of it as optimistic. And just to make another point, Becca, apropos of criticism, it's Auerbach who makes the really moving point, I think, that he says the opaque kind of narrative, because it's not self-explicatory, creates criticism, right? It's the not giving you everything that makes you want to go in and find out what there is more that is not at the surface. So in a funny way, according to him, this more opaque, elusive style is actually what generates criticism. And so it's optimistic
about being pessimistic.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I sort of wonder how much it is possible, even when someone is expressly trying via digression to exhaustively touch on everything, to what extent that can be achieved. Because I was sort of thinking about texts that do this, Proust is one that you mentioned, and then Moby Dick is another book that I could think of that sort of attempts to do this. I think James Wood says that he tries to touch every word in the English language. Mm-hmm. And then other sort of encyclopedic modernist novels, you mentioned Berlin Alexander Plots briefly in here. I think one way of reading these books is that they are attempts to enact the Greek model, digressing so much that they touch every word, touch everything in the universe. But another way of reading books like this, including maybe even Proust, is that they are sort of monuments to the impossibility of achieving that totality.
Well, I think, but it's funny because I think there are people who would argue that, let's say, Proust or Joyce actually succeeded, that there's very little in the human experience that isn't in these 2 books, and those are just the obvious kinds of examples. So I don't know. I mean, the question of, the success of this is maybe the wrong question to be asking. I think it's if I can revert to another author that I like, who is Cavafy, and this famous poem called Ithaca, it's the journey, not the destination, that makes everything worthwhile. So, that may be a cop-out, but there may be something to it, actually, the idea that it's just these amazing kind of journeys that are created by these vast works that is what satisfies. And, whether they get where they're going or do what they want to do is almost becomes a secondary consideration in a funny way.
No, I mean, to me, that seems totally true. I also want to talk to you about model building. So that's like a whole other part of this book, which has so much in it, is an account of your childhood and I guess adolescent hobby for a while of building like exactly accurate replicas of world historical structures that were destroyed. And so I thought it was interesting that there's a discussion of models and then there's sort of a contrasting discussion of monuments or memorials, in which a building is not exactly replicated, or maybe even there's a digressive relationship like to the original event. And the example of this is that you talk very movingly, I think, about the memorial at the Belzec death camp, where one walks around the perimeter of the place where people died in the Holocaust. And that seems like a sort of digressive way to get at the reality of that situation, as opposed to sort of like the modeling model, for lack of a better word. And I wondered what you thought of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, so look, I mean, at the end of the day, when you're writing a book about literature, you are writing a book about, and if your book is about authors and critics, you're ultimately writing a book about representation. How do we represent things? And in literature, we represent things in words and narratives. But for obvious reasons, because I got very involved in the Holocaust with the previous book, The Lost, there's a famous problem posed to questions of representation by the Holocaust, which is, can this enormous event be represented, or should it be represented? I mean, this is a famous question in Holocaust studies, which I'm not going to go into now, but because I dipped my toe in that subject, I became very aware of these notorious problems of representations, and that, everyone knows the famous dictum after Auschwitz, there can be no poetry, as if the historical event obliterated the possibility of literature. Now, clearly that didn't actually happen, because the Holocaust has generated itself a tremendous amount of literature. But it did get me thinking about this question of representation, or maybe representability, if that's a word. And that, so I was a great model maker when I was a child, and I started thinking about, I started thinking about models, which are sort of obvious kinds of representation, right? Reproductions on a smaller scale, which one could also argue are what certain kinds of narratives are as well. And I allowed myself to sort of go into this wacky personal history, because Sebald uses very famously in the novel of his, which is actually called The Rings of Saturn, a model, right? That there's somebody who's trying to build a model of the Temple of Jerusalem, which is a structure that has been repeatedly destroyed in real life, the great Temple of Jerusalem. And I just started, sort of connecting the dots, and using this, his model maker in his novel, and connecting it to what I was doing and my interest. I was always building models of the Parthenon, probably easy to believe for those people in the audience who know my work. What does it mean to make a model of something? And why do we value particularly models of things that have been destroyed? So I thought it was very exciting as a child to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art because they had this huge scale model of what the Parthenon looked like before it was destroyed. And so I started to use this sort of business of models as a kind of analogy, a simile of kinds for what literature is trying to do, especially a work like Auerbach's work, Mimesis, which I think rather poignantly, here he is almost from memory, rehearsing the whole history of Western literature, while he is actually in the East, in Istanbul, where he has had to flee because Europe was destroying itself yet again. And that's a kind of irony, which I think probably is worth thinking of. So he's sort of reconstituting all of Western literature in his head and then writing it down as a kind of model, because the real thing is tearing itself to pieces back in Europe. So that's why there's this sort of leitmotif in Three Rings about different models. My models, there's a point at which I wander into this museum in Israel, in Tel Aviv, where they have models of synagogues from all over the world. And that allows me to sort of reflect on the little synagogue in my own family, Shtetl in Eastern Poland, which is obviously destroyed. So all these things, these figures, the model, the temple, the memorial, it becomes a sort of oblique way of reflecting yet again on what literature is trying to do. I always think of something Leon Wieseltier told me when he had read The Lost, when it came out, and we had lunch in Washington, and he had written a wonderful book called Kaddish, which is a very important book for me. And he said, when he went to Poland, to this same area, which is now being destroyed actually yet again, what used to be Poland and is now Ukraine. And he said he kept, we were talking about Holocaust memorials, and that's a whole crazy question. And he said, I just went and I put a copy of my book out in the middle of this field where people had been killed. And so I wish I had actually put this story in Three Rings, because it's the place where the book and the history sort of come together. Why build a replica? Why make a model when the book is all you really need? But anyway, that's why models function in my book in the way that they do.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that sort of the failures of model making would give rise to the digressive impulse, because sort of, as you say, like just a model of something, even an exact model of something, absent the context and absent the traditions and the communal life that sort of breathes spirit into the structure, is kind of meaningless. So you'd have to supplement the model with more models, and then eventually
Right.
You'd have to just sort of like reconstruct the entire
You'd have to reconstruct the whole civilization in
You'd have
order
to do
to
Proust
really
forever. Which,
and in fact,
goal.
to talk about a little, just to make a final point, connecting to your point about paranoia, in Sebald's book, Three Rings, this guy has been trying to do an incredibly detailed scale model of the Great Temple of Jerusalem. But he himself says that he's sort of crippled by his awareness of how he can never get the level of detail that he wants, because as each new archaeological discovery is made, he has to go back and correct things. And he's sort of paralyzed by his knowledge of the distance between the original and the model. And it ultimately makes him incapable of completing his own model, because it would be endlessly detailed to the point where it's impossible to do, except to actually recreate the whole building.
Yeah, which is a great motif and works so well in the book. Well, perhaps that brings us back to the beginning in a circle. So we could do some Q&A maybe, but everybody should buy the book. It's great. I loved it. Better on a second reading. Very rich.
Wonderful. So I would encourage anyone, if you have questions for Daniel, to enter them now. And Becca, if you have one more question, I would welcome you to bring that to the floor and we'll see.
Many.
And then, fantastic.
I mean, you say in the book that you are an optimist, and I was wondering about that. Is that because you sort of have to be in order to do criticism? Is that like a temperamental thing? Do you think the evidence sort of supports optimism about the interconnectedness of things and like the referentiality of life?
Well, I'm an optimist in the sense that I believe, look, when you work on the Holocaust as a subject for a very long time, it doesn't make you optimistic about human nature. I'm not that kind of optimist.
Or narrative optimist, I would say.
But I'm a narrative optimist, or I'm an aesthetic optimist, because one of the things that we do know from history is that no matter how great the horrors that history creates, we as a species almost invariably respond with creation to destruction. We make art. There was poetry after Auschwitz. There was great poetry after Auschwitz. And so in that sense, I'm an optimist. I believe in, as horrible as human nature can be, the human mind is an impressive object. And so in that sense, I'm an optimist, because there's nothing terrible that has ever happened that has not created beauty somehow. The most terrible events in history have created some of the greatest art that we have. I mean, think of the Black Death, and out of that came the Decameron, which has outlived the memory of every single person who died in the Black Death. So that's the trade-off. And in that sense, I'm an optimist. Although, as I say, when you spend 5 years interviewing Holocaust survivors, your opinion of human nature does not improve, I think it's safe to say. But I am an optimist about culture as almost distinct from what people do. That's a little paradoxical, but I think you know what I mean.
Definitely over and above what people do.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So we do have some pretty great questions in the Q&A here, and I think just the perfect amount. So let's start with this question from Bill, which just says, thoughts on translating Cavafy and Homer? Thank you.
Thoughts on translating Cavafy and Homer? Well, I just finished this new translation of the Odyssey, and there are a lot of thoughts on translating Cavafy and Homer. I would say that, to sort of try to bring the question back to the subject of the conversation we've been having, I would say that, no act makes you as intimate with a text as translating does. And that I feel very fortunate that I've gotten to translate these two figures who are so important to me. These are works I thought I knew well, but nothing makes you understand a work as much as translating it, because you have to sort of achieve this strange intimacy with an author. You basically have to tell yourself that you know what they would have done if they were writing in your language, which is a kind of mad presumptuousness, but it's a very interesting process. So anyway, when my translation of the Odyssey comes out, I hope I'll be doing a Green Apple event in person, and we can talk more about translating then. But there are many thoughts on that subject, but maybe we should turn to another question at this point that's more geared to Three Rings.
I second that hope. Let's see. Sarah asks, do you have any comments on Keats's negative capability, or staying with uncertainty, or Wittgenstein's metaphor of language as a ladder to use and discard, or Chinese view of language as non-mimetic, indexical, or quote, finger pointing at the moon?
Well, yeah, I have a lot of things to say. I think a great deal This is going to be a response to this question that's more about criticism, I would say, or is more applicable to the practice of criticism. But, you know, Keats' idea of negative capability, staying with uncertainty, the ability to keep two notions in suspension at the same time is something I think about a lot, because I think we're in a kind of anti-critical moment in time. And I encounter this quite a lot in teaching undergraduates, you know, where there tends to be more and more, I think, a sort of rigid binary approach to literature, which I think is kind of anti-literary. I mean, I think what makes a great author great is directly proportional to the amount of negative capability that the text contains, you know. And the students always want to know, like, who's the bad guy and who's the good guy, and, you know, stuff like that. And I find it very odd. And so I think, you know, I'm always sort of hymning the praises of negative capability. I mean, in terms of, I see where the question is going about, it's ultimately, you know, a question about literature's attempt to portray reality as an endlessly losing game almost. But, you know, as I said before, it's the trying and the striving that creates the great art. You know, ultimately, literature can't be equal to human experience. It is a representation of experience. But it's exciting when it seems to mimic things that we understand to be real about life. And I think that's what Auerbach was interested in. But anyway, I do think that these, you know, in this question, there were these, you know, a list of approaches that doubt the ability, that doubt the possibility of perfect representation. But again, as we were saying before in a slightly different key, you know, it's the impossibility that generates these fascinating texts, right? If it were totally possible to sort of get everything right, then people would stop writing, if you see what I mean. So it's this sort of the endless failure or approximation or distance between the ideal and the real that generates more art making. So that seems to me a nice thing.
We have another question that I think actually segues quite well into what you just said, or builds on it without repeating it. This is from Anderson, who says, speaking of models, in your book, you talk about reconstructing places to their peak. But of course, as you mentioned, the creation of that reconstruction is itself destructive, and some places have multiple peaks, if you will, of historical digressions. Do you think this applies to works of art and culture as well? And what do you think that does to a work? And if so, is it an act of direct resurrection or an act of total transformation?
It's a great and complex question. So what the person who's asked this question is referring to, that there's a certain point in Three Rings where I'm talking about this business of making models and sort of reconstructing. And I use as an example a debate that took place when Greece became an independent nation, which is actually 200 years ago. They're celebrating their bicentennial this year. There was a great question about what to do with the Acropolis, you know, and I should say that in Three Rings, the building that I keep talking about is the Parthenon, which was destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt, and there are models and blah, 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 my models, everybody else's models. And I rehearsed the history of the debate about what should the Parthenon look like, you know. So anyone who's been to Athens knows that it's interminably under restoration. You know, it's never without scaffolding, which I think is sort of a little novella in itself, you could say, you know. But in the 1820s, you know, so finally Greece was a free nation. It had overthrown the Ottoman empire. And at that point, this is the point at which Lord Elgin was taking the marbles very controversially, although there's a very good argument to be made that he was actually trying to preserve it because people were carting off marble right and left and using it to burn in lime kilns. So there was a great argument. What should it look like? Because the Parthenon itself had many different phases. It was built as a temple of Athena, but it actually had a much longer life as a Christian church after Christianity predominated. And then it was actually a mosque and it had a little minaret that they added at the end. So the question of how to restore it actually became a sort of interesting debate about what it actually was. It was actually a Christian church for longer than it was a temple to Athena. And so when they restored it, to which of its many incarnations over 2,500 years ought to it have been restored? And obviously they went with the Temple of Athena, because that was a product of a culture that was associated with Periclean Athens and the birth of democracy. And that's the signal this newly born state wanted to save. But it got me thinking about this issue of when we talk about restorations or modeling or whatever, which original are we talking about? Nothing is actually stable. It's like those, I remember when I was a kid, I went to the World's Fair and they had this thing you could walk over, this model of New York City. And a scale model of New York City with all the boroughs, and you walked on this sort of plexiglass platform above this. And now it would be barely recognizable. So 2,000 years from now, if there's a great debate, about what Madison Square Garden looked like, well, when? In the 1920s and the 1970s, right? So that itself, I think, it can be applied to art and culture. Look at the great controversy that erupted when the Sistine Chapel ceiling was cleaned. And, like, who knew there were those bright colors, right? Because we got so used to it being sort of all smoky and dark. And that's what we thought of when we thought of Michelangelo. And it turns out he was painting in day glow colors, right? So I think these are interesting questions because it forces us to constantly confront a question that, and this is something one deals with often as a classicist, that our fantasy of what the past looks like is itself so conditioned by what we want, that we can't even see the past for what it was. Well, to use a classical example, because the questioner is asking about other parts of art and culture, we now know that all these Greek statues were painted in very bright colors, right? The Parthenon was an incredibly gaudy building. It was not this pure, pristine white structure. And that's very disorienting for people who think that a Greek statue is some naked thing with no arms and it's white, right? So I think these are interesting questions because we often have a fantasy about the past, which doesn't quite jive with what the past actually looked like. And as we know, what it actually looked like had many stages anyway. So the past is more unstable than I think we'd like to think.
Thank you. Thanks so much. We have really great questions here, but I think we'll do one final one. And I think it speaks to the kind of exile of the writers that or is relevant to the exile of the artists that are featured in your book. This is from Emma, who says, Professor Mendelsohn, thanks for a fascinating talk. Do you think your book would have been structured differently at all if you had written it during the pandemic?
Not really, actually. I don't think the pandemic would have had an effect on the structure of the book, as far as I can tell. I'm sort of fascinated to know why Emma thinks I would have structured it differently. I mean, the pandemic obviously affected us all in great ways, but No, I mean, I think this book was very much the product, as I said, of a great amount of thinking about a specific set of questions. Well, I guess I see what Emma is getting at, actually, in the sense that because the pandemic resulted in a lot of being stationary, being isolated, and the book is really about movement. I mean, the book is about endless series of migrations and both literal and figurative, because it's not only all three of my writers were exiles or refugees, but I'm also talking about whole histories of populations, the Jews and Muslims fleeing, forced out of Spain in 1492, going to Constantinople, the Byzantine monks being chased out of Constantinople when it fell to the Ottomans in 1453. So there's a lot of moving around in this book. And I think, what Emma is getting at, right? So would I have thought about all that movement in a different way during the pandemic, when so many of us were sort of locked in the same room, sometimes even for a long period of time? That's an interesting thing to think about. I'm not so sure, Emma, I have a answer to the question, but it may well be that I would have thought about motion and mobility and immobility in a slightly different way during the pandemic. But it's like that Ray Bradbury story, A Sound of Thunder, or whatever it was called, A Distant Thunder, something like that. If one thing changes in the past, everything changes. So if I had written the book in the pandemic, it would have been different in many other ways as well, probably as well. But it's an interesting question. Thank you for that.
Well, everyone, I'm so grateful that folks had really well thought out and considered questions for you. And unfortunately, we don't have time to answer them all, but I'm so grateful for everyone's engagement in our discussion tonight. I'm appreciative of you all, and I'm especially appreciative of Daniel and of Becca for joining us this evening. And I would be remiss if I didn't share the link to Daniel's book once more in the chat, so you folks can find it at Green Apple Books' website. Thank you so much for celebrating Three Rings with us, all of you out there, and to you, Daniel and Becca.
Thank you, Becca. Thank you.
Thanks for writing such a good book.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I'll say good night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.